Thanks for staying with us. Welcome back. Cosatu says it's concerned that discrepancies in the country's education system remain prevalent following the release of the matric results. There are also growing calls for NSFAS to be more accessible as students prepare for tertiary education. Social justice activist Busi Seabe joins us for more. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. As these calls are made right at the start of the 2023 academic year, where students are looking to return and, of course, others are new in the system, hoping to also access this funding. What are your remarks around this as the challenges prevail?
What Cosatu is calling for, firstly, I must say thank you very much for having me. But what Cosatu is calling for is very regressive, especially considering that Cosatu itself supported the Fees Must Fall movement and the call for free, quality, decolonized education. And a part of that call for free, quality, decolonized education by the Fees Must Fall movement was, the accessibility of education and funding as well being free, quality, decolonized education. So NSFAS in its current form is an institution of exclusion, not inclusion. Its constitutionality is very doubtful, and moreover, its approach is flawed based on the income or wealth profile of South African households. So in essence, NSFAS has numerous systematic challenges that makes it inefficient and a perpetual failure. This is why the Fees Must Fall movement had long called and recommended the restricting of its powers and mandate to research and standard setting alone. It comes as no surprise at this particular point in time that education in South Africa remains inaccessible. And this comes especially after the current corrupt president, Cyril, Ramaphosa, reversed a decision taken by the former president, Jacob Zuma, in 2017, wherein Zuma declared that, NSFAS and the scheme itself and its packages already allocated to existing NSFAS students would more than anything else be a subsidy or a grant rather than a loan, as it is currently now at this particular point in time. So moreover, there were several, reversal of policies that, Jacob Zuma tried to implement during his tenure, and the policy intervention that would have enabled government to extend fully subsidized free higher education to youth from all over, accounting for about 90% of South African households, is something that has currently been reversed. And this is why we're finding an issue around inaccessibility of higher education. But more than anything else, I think we must be very clear about the fact that the biggest challenge that South Africa faces at the moment in education is not only the issue of fees, but the continued poor access and very high dropout rates for those who have entered the system. So while there has been, an impressive increase in the number of black students, also from poor households, the proportion of black students at South African universities are very limited. And when it comes to NSFAS to a large extent, among there being, supported call for, it to extend the amount of funding that it provides students, it is unable to deal with the issues that students face when they're in institutions of higher learning, such as accommodation fees increasing, such as, sustainability in terms of buying food and them being able to be supported outside of just being paying for their education. So NSFAS as a system in its entirety is very flawed. Moreover, there are approximately 22.1 million young people in this country, and not all of them are going to be able to access institutions of higher learning. This is because we only have about 26 universities and about 50 TVET colleges, and that alone does not capacitate and will not be able to capacitate the number of young people that are now progressively moving outside of the secondary phase of education. And this is a challenge that our government is failing to meet. What happens to young people who aren't able to access institutions of higher learning? Because our conversation can't just be centered around those who are fortunate enough to gain access or those who qualify to gain access. When you look at our secondary education system being, our high school system, you find that to a large extent, the pass rate has made it very difficult for young people to be able to even access TVET colleges. I mean, a 30% pass rate, although to some degree it might give you access into some TVET colleges, it definitely definitely won't get you access into a university of higher learning, especially a university like Wits University, UCT, UP, and all these other institutions. So then what happens to the majority of young people that can't go into institutions of higher learning? They're left to languish in poverty. They're left to do kasi management, as we call it, and hang around in the township and essentially become susceptible to drugs and crime and other social ills. So what our government is not taking into cognizance is that, fees must fall did speak about and has perpetually advocated for the removal of NSFAS as a funding scheme, because to a large extent it is unable to meet the needs that young people have when going into institutions of higher learning. Many students at the moment have had their funding by NSFAS revoked, and others are going to be financially excluded in this academic year, which means they don't even get to complete their academic studies. And this will create a very big class divide between not only those who are in, the missing middle and the poorest of the poor, but those who are able to effectively afford access into higher education. Moreover, we also need to be able to look at what our economy is willing and able to, supplement when it comes to higher education. Where's the private sector when we speak about higher education and accessibility of higher education? To a large extent, we need to be able to look at all the mechanisms and all the organizations and institutions that are available to us to be able to adequately plan around an education system that is not failing young people, but one that affords them the opportunity to contribute and participate in the economy, which it doesn't at the moment.
What are your thoughts, as you speak about NSFAS's flawed system, what are your thoughts around what was recently unveiled by the Auditor General, Zakane Maluleke, whose recent report found that NSFAS made payments that were not in line with students' contracts, and also speaking to some of the recommendations that were put forward by the AG, which have not been implemented by NSFAS as you and I speak?
At this particular point in moment, I think we must all recognize that whenever the AG puts in recommendations, they are perpetually ignored by those who have the political will and have the political means to implement those recommendations. Moreover, when you look at the fact that, the AG did report that there are funds that are being misused, this speaks to the corruption and the mismanagement of funds within the NSFAS system and organization in its entirety. And this is why, to a large extent, the students during the Fees Must Fall movement, we wanted the scrapping of the NSFAS, entire system. An example of this would be the young lady who received 14 million rand from NSFAS as a means of, government employees using corruption and swindling funds out of, the coffers outside of the budget of NSFAS that was meant for students. This is a reoccurring theme within NSFAS, where to a large extent they don't meet the requirements and they don't meet the standard that they're supposed to be providing. This does not come to a shock to a lot of us, and we can and should expect even more corruption. If we were to audit NSFAS a little closely, I think we will find that a lot of the funds that didn't go to students went to employees, went to certain individuals that are there to enrich themselves using a system of government that is not regulated effectively, that is not being governed effectively. And this is the problem that we're faced with at the moment. We have a system, we have funds that are supposed to be there to cater to young people, but unfortunately they're not reaching the masses of young people that they're supposed to reach. And to a large extent, we're going to continue to see this kind of corruption, and it will continue to even worsen to an extent that even more students who are in their final years, second years, will become financially excluded from institutions of higher learning, because NSFAS in July can wake up and say they no longer have funds and they don't know where the money went. And there is no accountability when it comes to corruption.
Which is pretty much, if you'll allow me to interrupt you, which is pretty much what we saw at the start of the academic year, where members of SRCs were talking about how they are going to do their best to ensure that those who still need to continue their studies but have been denied entry, so to speak, by NSFAS are able to still do so. And as we make mention of the Auditor General, we know that part of her recommendations included recovering owed monies from colleges and students. What are your thoughts around that?
outside of just recovering money from, colleges and from students, I think we must remember, the policy intervention that former President Jacob Zuma attempted to implement in 2017 in moving the NSFAS from a bursary into something that was essentially a grant. And that is to speak to us having free, quality, decolonized education. And that was the trajectory that NSFAS was supposed to move at. To a large extent, because young people who have been fortunate enough to get their qualifications and are now outside of the university, we must realize that the reality is they aren't able to access employment, which means that realistically they won't be able to repay even those loans and repay that money that they got from NSFAS to begin with, because the economy is unable to absorb them. And this speaks to economic growth and the economic challenges that we are faced with in society that to a large extent are leading to a broader range of socioeconomic challenges and issues. So to a large extent, recouping the money from colleges is something that is more viable than trying to recoup the money from individuals who realistically can't access employment. And we must be able to face that reality and find alternatives. And I think the AG's recommendations need to be specific around the kinds of individuals who can repay those bursaries or those loans, essentially, as NSFAS calls them now. Repay those loans. We need to be able to see if young people have been able to acquire employment following acquiring their degrees from institutions of higher learning. Yeah. And only then can we have that conversation about recouping that money. But colleges and universities must definitely pay back the money.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for weighing in. Busi Seabe, a social justice activist, joining us there, speaking about the NSFAS funding.